Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the PrimateCast. We're your hosts, Andrew McIntosh.
And Chris Martin.
And today we're going to continue our apparent series of podcasts on conservation issues. The last couple we've been speaking with Dr. Cricket Sanz and Tomoaki Nishihara. And today we're going to be joined by another conservationist, but this time one set in the United States. So Dr. Steve Ross. Chris, can you tell us about him?
Sure. So like you said, Steve is involved in conservation through the zoo he works for, Lincoln Park Zoo, that zoo has a major focus on conservation. And at Lincoln Park, he is the director of the Lester E. Fisher Center for the Study and Conservation of Apes. And he also has a responsibility for kind of a multi-zoo effort, which is he's the chair of the Species Survival Plan, which is a multi-institute effort to manage the population of chimpanzees living in zoos that are accredited by the Association for Zoos and Aquariums in the United States.
Yeah, so Steve seems to have a lot of things on his plate these days. He's actually involved in a lot of different projects, a lot of different committees, and that should become very apparent to listeners throughout this interview, where we do talk about issues for conservation and welfare, specifically welfare in zoos for chimpanzees, but also their, for example, their historic use in biomedical research in the U.S. and things like that.
Yeah, so he has kind of a very broad interest in chimps, so that ranges from conservation to welfare, but also he's doing cognitive research at the Lester E. Fisher, which is interesting for me as a cognitive researcher.
And it's one of the reasons why he was in Japan this last time too.
That's right.
But he also, in the interview, talks about the interesting phenomena of public perception of chimpanzees and what that means for the way that the public engages in conservation issues or even understands conservation issues.
Absolutely. Okay, so here is Steve talking about why he's in Japan.
This is my third or fourth time being in Japan, and each time it's been to visit the Primate Research Institute. Mm-hmm. I've known Professor Matsuzawa for about a decade, and a lot of the work that I do at Lincoln Park Zoo is sort of based on the work that's done here at PRI.
Right.
So, as I've said to a couple of people, I come back to Japan every 3 years, whether I need to or not. I really enjoy it here. And not just for the science, I really enjoy the people as well.
I know that you also enjoy the karaoke.
I do, and only a few people know how much I do.
Well, plus all the audience of the PrimateCast here.
Right. I'm sure a lot of them are there for your karaoke night at IPS.
And just a side note, I hear this time you're actually going to see something other than the chimpanzees at the PRI.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe for anyone who knows me that I would be doing anything other than chimpanzee work. But I'm going to be visiting some of the natural habitat for the Japanese macaques as well, because Lincoln Park Zoo is building a new exhibit for them.
Oh.
Yeah, so let's get onto that Lincoln Park Zoo. So you guys are pretty much one of the leaders, I suppose, in the U.S., but also probably in the world as well now with the facilities you've been able to set up there. Can you talk about that, the Regenstein Center and also the Lester E. Fisher Center?
Yeah, Lincoln Park Zoo has long been a sort of a leader in zoo-based conservation and science, but it's really grown over the past couple of years. When I joined the zoo in 2000, the conservation science staff was about 5 people, and today it's, I believe, 42. We've got 18 PhDs in our relatively small zoo. We're a small urban zoo. So we've got a number of different programs, and the center that I work with is the Lester Fisher Center for the Study and Conservation of Apes. And we have more researchers than we do apes. So it's a pretty productive center. We do everything from field work with a couple sites in Africa to a lot of on-grounds research, cognitive research, and as well as some advocacy work too.
Now, when Jane Goodall came onto our podcast, she actually mentioned that a turning point in her career was a conference at Lincoln Park Zoo in the 1980s. Maybe it was in Chicago. I don't know if it was specifically at Lincoln Park. Was it?
It wasn't at Lincoln Park Zoo, but yet it was kind of, because it was at the Chicago Academy of Sciences, and that building has since been transferred over to our administrative building.
I see.
Yeah.
And she actually mentioned that that's when she first kind of realized that she needed to change her focus from the research to the conservation. So can you talk a little bit about the history of kind of the chimpanzee research community meeting at Lincoln Park and kind of using it as a locus for communication?
Yeah, it's one of the oldest zoos in the country, so we have a long history in a lot of things, but one of which is apes. And so now, since that initial conference what James was at, in which a number of different field sites came together and talked about their research. There's now been two subsequent meetings, just based purely on chimpanzees, the most recent being in 2007, which the Lester Fisher Center hosted, called The Mind of the Chimpanzee. And so, I think in many ways it's a regular every 10-year thing for primatologists who study chimpanzees to descend upon Chicago and talk chimp.
That's great. Wow. And also IPS is in Chicago. So.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. So it's just been announced that in 2016, it'll actually be a joint meeting of the American Society of Primatologists and the International Primatological Society, and we're going to have the next in the chimpanzee series.
Oh, wow.
So it'll all be the same place. So I'm sure I'll see both of you there in 2016.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a podcast.
a remote
podcast.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you have time to visit us in Japan with all these other things going on there.
Yeah, I've got a lot of interns. Yeah.
Very cool.
But just returning briefly to the Jane conversation, so the Lincoln Park Zoo also did have projects involved with both at Gombe and more recently at the Guologo Triangle with Cricket-sans and David Morgan. But can you just talk a little bit about those?
Yep. Dave Morgan is a full-time member of the Fisher Center staff, and so even though we only see him a couple times a year, he spends between 8 and 10 months a year in Guologo in the Republic of Congo, and that represents our main forward into field research. And so that's someone who works not only in terms of tool use with his wife Cricket, but in terms of the impact of logging in Central Africa. And so working with Dave has been great because I'm not a field researcher at all. I work almost exclusively with captive chimps. So Dave represents a really important part of the Fisher Center and showing a commitment to field conservation.
I think there's a really nice bridge there because you and your career have been really focused on improving the livelihoods or lives of the animals in captivity. And I think their research in Guologo is a great example of kind of progressive conservation work. So you're both you have similar aims in just different realms.
That's exactly right. And we always talk about it. We're both interested in chimp welfare, just sort of on a different level and on different continents. But I think without one or the other, the Fisher Center really wouldn't be the same. We're very invested in both on grounds, animal welfare issues within the country, United States, but also conservation in Africa.
So it seems to me like Lincoln Park has done a really great job of kind of balancing enrichment and research with conservation, and it's kind of leading the pack, I think, in terms of having a well-rounded zoo with different goals and ways to achieve those goals. So what do you see for the future of zoos in general? And I'm talking about research at zoos and also kind of doing this research alongside conservation.
Well, I think what I hear a lot from other zoos is some surprise that we're able to maintain such a large conservation and science department and such a research group. And what I constantly get is, how can you afford to do that? And what they're often surprised to know is that we don't come out of the operating budget at all. We're almost completely grant-based, some of which are government grants, a lot of which are foundation grants. And I think that's eye-opening to a lot of zoos in saying that they can have a great conservation research program and it not take away from the animal care, the education, all the sort of base components to a zoo. And I'm hoping that will sort of inspire some other zoos to sort of take this on. Maybe they can't have a staff of 40 people right from the beginning, but I'm seeing more and more a zoo sort of stick their little toe in the water, say, hey, if we hire one scientist, then maybe that can lead to another and lead to another. I mean, I myself at Lincoln Park Zoo started as a part-time researcher, turned into a full-time thing, and then before you know it, we had a rather large staff.
So something a little bit obscure, but we're talking now about great ape welfare and conservation, but I think I read somewhere that you might have started out in animal behavior studying pigs.
Yep. I started in Canada studying pigs. Now, I knew at the time that I wanted to work with chimps. I've known that for a long time, but when you grow up in Canada, there's not many chimps up there. And so I started actually with a fairly prominent animal behaviorist named David Fraser. He's at University of British Columbia now. He's one of the leaders in captive animal welfare, specifically farm animal welfare. And we were studying the impact of alternative housing systems for pigs that would end up as bacon someday. And it really gave me some initial insight as to the importance of physical environment, social environment in terms of behavior and welfare. So I spent all day, first drawing numbers on the back of pigs with big black markers so that we could record them with the overhead video cameras. Spent a lot of time measuring their weights, because that was one of the primary measures of welfare for pigs, was simply weight. And then doing a lot of behavioral data collection. All of that now, 15, 20 years later, has proved to be super beneficial to me. I use a lot of those same techniques now with apes. Didn't know it at the time, but it's been really beneficial.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a perfect transition.
Yeah.
I mean, so how do you see the progression of science-based, let's say, enrichment or welfare activities these days?
It's a slow process. It's frustratingly slow for someone who's sort of worked in that field for a while. I mean, and it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, I'm a big advocate for using sort of evidence-based science in order to promote increased welfare practices, enrichment, and so on. But the other side of the coin, though, is that it can be used against you. So you might feel very strongly that chimps or other animals should have more space or have certain practices to increase the welfare, and that can be resisted because the correct studies haven't been done. And so I have mixed feelings, a love-hate relationship with sort of evidence-based reasoning in terms of it being able to actually progress animal care.
Now, so another thing that's maybe relevant to that is the in a zoo setting, for example, is the visitors. So I know you've also done some research balancing the type of enclosure or the way that the design is implemented versus being something that's pleasing for visitors and not
right.
so taxing for the animals.
That was eye-opening for me. When I first started at Lincoln Park Zoo, I was actually hired to do research that would inform the design of the Regenstein Center for African Apes. And I wasn't a zoo person at all. So I didn't come in with the usual preconceptions of, you have to draw up these architectural plans so that they're pretty looking and that they're good for visitors and so on. I came in with a completely animal-centric viewpoint. And but I didn't know it at the time that I was doing things a bit differently. So we did 4 years of research basically on other facilities as well as our own apes in the old facility to design the space. We had some eye to visitor experience, of course, but for the most part we built facilities that catered to what animals like, and we got their preferences through behavioral research. So that it's a building built not only for animal research, to do animal research, but also by animal research.
So can you tell us about Project Chimp Care?
Yep, Project Chimp Care is it's a different type of scientific venture. I still think, even though it's advocacy based, it's really research as well. I'll tell the long story of it. Basically, I'm the chair of the SSP, which manages all the chimps in the zoos. And we were more and more through the early 2000s getting calls from people who had pet chimpanzees, and that's still perfectly legal in the United States. And they were saying, can you please take our pet chimpanzee off of us, where we need to place him in a zoo or something like that. And that was becoming more and more frequent. And I realized that even though a lot of people were aware that this was happening in the United States, that there were pets out there in people's backyards and garages and so on, no one had really quantified it at all, or no one really understood what was going on or how those chimps were housed.
Can we kind of go back a little bit here and just can you tell us why this was the situation?
Yeah.
So first of all, why are there so many chimps in the US? And how did they end up in backyards? So I think that's pretty interesting.
That's too long for this podcast.
Yeah, sure.
But one of the big reasons, and I think actually the biggest reason for it, stems back a couple decades when in the United States, whether a species is considered endangered or not is part of this Endangered Species Act, the ESA. And originally chimpanzees were considered endangered. And so therefore they were granted certain protections. But at a certain point they were downlisted to threatened, which is the next highest status that doesn't have all the protections. In other words, if you're not endangered, you can be bought and sold on the open market. And they were downlisted in part because there was a fairly large lobby group to use them in biomedical research. Mm-hmm. And because of that downlisting, a whole commerce-based industry on buying and selling chimpanzees flourished throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And zoos were part of that as well. A lot of animals moved from zoos to labs and then back out to private hands again. Since that time, they've actually split-listed chimpanzees. It's a very unique situation in that no other animals have such a split listing, but basically wild chimpanzees are considered endangered, but captive chimpanzees aren't, which seems ludicrous to many of us. And that continues today. So because of that, chimpanzees aren't endangered, so therefore it's completely legal still to own, buy, sell as chimps, and they've flourished. There's almost 3 times as many chimps in the United States as there are in the country of Tanzania.
So that's amazing. It's hard to get wrap your head around. So, as I understand it, this is the first effort to create a database in America of all the chimps that are out there and who they belong to, which is something that has been done in Japan before.
That's right. And it started out almost as a census, and like a lot of things that I do, it had its sort of philosophical origins in stuff that PRI helped run. So the GAIN network was something that inspired me to do this sort of census. And we spent about 2 years physically traveling around the United States, because it's one thing to count up the number of chimps that are in public zoos. It's not that difficult to sort of figure out how many there are and where they are. But to locate chimps that are tied up to a chain in someone's backyard in rural Mississippi is much more difficult. So we spent a total of 24 months traveling around the United States and finding all these chimps. And then being very systematic in terms of the information we collected on all these chimps, and then entered them into a database. One level of that database is available on the website, so you can sort of see in general how many chimps are in each state.
Right, so that's chimpcare.org.
That is chimpcare.org, and we maintain that database even to this day. So just a couple months ago, the last pet chimpanzee in the state of California died, and we were aware he was there. And because ChimpCare has sort of become more and more prominent, we were notified when he died. We updated the database, and now, if you go online, you'll see that there's no more pet chimpanzees in California.
Wow. Okay, so I want to ask a related question to ChimpCare, and that's a series of studies that you've done on public perceptions of chimps. And I know that perception is shaped a lot by these privately owned entertainment chimps. So could you talk a little bit about, what happens when people see a chimp in a commercial, and how does that affect kind of people's perceptions of wild chimps and their status?
Yeah, we knew very early on sort of the issues that were at play there. We knew that when people saw chimpanzees on TV, that they didn't perceive them the same way that, say, the 3 of us would perceive chimpanzees. But there was no quantifiable evidence of this. So we took on that problem by doing a number of surveys. The last of which that we've published used a experimental design in which we had used sort of Photoshop to alter different photographs of the same chimpanzee, to put a human being beside them, or to put them in different settings, whether it's a zoo setting or a wild setting, or in an office building. And using this sort of paradigm, we were able to sort of tease out what the different effects of different images of chimpanzees were. And we were able to relate very quickly. Actually, the results were very clear, that simply having a person next to a chimpanzee, standing next to them in free space, not only made people think that chimpanzees might make good pets, but also made them think that they weren't endangered in the wild. And this is something I think a lot of us have sort of suspected, but it was nice to get that empirical evidence of that exact effect. So now when we talk about the use of chimpanzees in entertainment in the United States and elsewhere in the world, there's not only this argument that's based on animal welfare and how those chimps are treated, but also in terms of conservation, that these things are actually have an effect on wild chimpanzees. If you don't think they're in danger, why would you possibly support a conservation organization?
Right. And I saw your interview on TV, so you were on Fox News. And I if I remember correctly, the host made kind of this point that, if people see chimps in commercials, then they'll form kind of an emotional attachment to chimps, and then they'll be more concerned with chimps. But what you're saying is kind of a different story. It's that perception itself, even though they're interested in chimps because they saw it in a commercial, it's kind of the wrong perception that they're getting.
That's right. And the argument that he gave is the same one I hear all the time from those who use chimpanzees.
Right. So what's kind of your main response to it, to kind of dealing with that perspective that a lot of people seem to have? Yeah,
if you look at the way the data reads, that emotional connection is certainly just washed out by this overwhelming feeling. They might like them, but they don't think they're endangered.
Right.
So even though we did ask questions of affect as well, we asked how they felt about chimpanzees, and they were no more likely to think that the chimpanzee in the picture was happy or not.
Right.
So that's unchanged. But when we ask them whether they're endangered or not, oh no, they're perfectly safe. Why? The thing we hear often from the general public is, what if they're endangered, they wouldn't be in commercials. That's a very overwhelming sentiment when you talk to the general public, and that's the sort of thing that we're combating.
Yep. It seems like an uphill battle. I mean, so like chimps capture people's imaginations.
That's right.
Because they're so close to humans, and it seems to me like even if you eliminate chimps from acting in commercials, there might still be an effort to use chimps, either CGI chimps, like in Planet of the Apes, and it's hard to say, that from your perspective that might not be a good thing, because even though it's not a chip, it looks like a chip. CGI is pretty good, so
that's right. And then, this is why when the latest Planet of the Apes, they sort of have that mixed feelings, because I don't think that helps in the perception. I think people will see them, they don't know, especially with the CGI now.
Right.
It looks real, so it's probably having all those same effects.
Yep.
But you've won the animal welfare side of it. I think ultimately that's these arguments about perceptions and how they affect conservation and pet ownership is in a way just ammunition so that we can get all the chimps out of that business. Yep. I mean, they're all legitimate effects, but if we can end the use of apes to entertainment, I think we'll have come a long way. And to be honest, in the past 15 years, the number of chimps used specifically for entertainment has gone down from about 70 down to about 12 or 15. So there's really only one major player left in that industry right now. So I think we've come a long way.
Oh, that's great.
So another uphill battle that recently had an interesting result that you were heavily involved in was the use of chimpanzees in biomedical research. So that's maybe a more provocative issue, especially in the scientific area, where there's probably a lot more debate.
That's right.
So can you just walk us through that and what the recent decision was?
Sure.
Of the NIH?
So, wow, yeah, where to begin? There's been growing concern about the use of chimps in invasive biomedical research. And so there's about 950 chimps in the United States that are housed in laboratories, some used in non-invasive cognitive research, but some are still used in invasive research. They were heavily bred throughout the 80s to combat the AIDS virus, for which later they were found not to be a great model. And since that time, this debate has sort of simmered for a while, until a few years ago when some chimpanzees were to be moved from one research center to another, and that raised a lot of public concern. And as a result, there was an IOM, an Institute of Medicine committee, that debated and contributed for a year, I think, and then they came out with a report that said, well, basically chimp research is not really essential anymore. But they left a lot of definitions open and waiting, so they did what we do in America, which is to create another committee to interpret the first committees. And so that second committee was the Council of Councils working group on the use of chimpanzees in NIH-sponsored research. So it was very specific to chimpanzees that were owned by NIH for research, most especially invasive research. I was on that working group. I was the only one on the working group who currently work with chimpanzees. There was one other person on the working group, Dr. Danny Povinelli, who had experience with chimpanzees, but he resigned from the group about 2/3 of the way through. And this group was put in place to interpret the IOM report and to make sort of practical suggestions and recommendations to NIH about what we should do about this problem. In January of this year, we released a report that had a number of outcomes, one of which was to reduce the research population down to a very, very small size, from about 950 down to maybe only 50, and that the way that these chimpanzees should be housed had to be greatly improved. So right now, the main regulations that surround chimpanzees in labs are USDA minimum standards. The minimum standard for chimpanzees is 10 by 10 by 10 feet. And these recommendations say that each chimpanzee should have approximately 1,000 square feet of space. So it's a monstrous increase in terms of the way they're housed. Now, there was many other recommendations, including a minimum social group size of 7. And this gets back to something we talked about earlier, about evidence-based research. Mm-hmm. And I think critics of these types of recommendations would say, well, why is a group of 7 a magic number? can't a group of 6 be perfectly happy? We know wild chimpanzees wander off as groups of 2 for months at a time. But I would argue that I think it's time that we start progressing, start pushing forward a little bit in the way that chimpanzees are housed and cared for, and that we consulted a number of different experts. And these numbers that we put in the report are sort of a culmination of all that, sort of best practices. And so that's currently being debated by the NIH, and they're going to respond whether they accept the recommendations hopefully soon.
Well, sounds like a huge effort.
It was a lot of work, and a lot of ulcers later. We got it done, but it's a labor of love, because this is what I think you guys and myself are all interested in, is improving the lives of chimpanzees, whether it's through research or whether it's through enrichment or whether it's through other means. And I think there's a lot of people in laboratory environments feel the exact same way. Mm-hmm. So it's up to the NIH, and frankly speaking, what it's down to now is not just philosophy, but money. This is a $400 million problem.
Wow. So was there a modicum of closure with that, or is it still just too many questions left for you?
Yeah, for me personally, it will remain open, I think, for a little while longer, at least till NIH makes a response to it. But even then, I think no one with any reasonable expectation is going to think that all those chimps are going to be properly housed overnight. This is maybe even not within our lifetimes that this problem will be completely solved. But it's a large number of chimpanzees.
Okay, so I have one more question, and that's what you're describing with socially housed chimpanzees with a lot of space and only certain types of non-invasive kind of voluntary research protocols. What you're describing sounds a lot to me like a zoo environment. And so I wonder if what you think about, I asked this before about the future of research at zoos, but do you see that as a direct result of this NIH recommendation, kind of there becoming more of an emphasis put on research in zoo environments?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity, both in terms of chimp research, but also for zoos. Yeah. I think this is the sort of thing that if researchers want to continue to ask all the questions that I still think are very interesting, mm-hmm. and they want to do so in environments that maybe meet the emerging standard of the public and of professionals, then zoos tend to be a really good place to do that. Mm-hmm. Today, there's not enough of that going on in zoos, in my estimation, but maybe something like this can sort of push that forward.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're optimistic. That's great.
Yeah, it's been great having you on the PrimateCast, Steve. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you both.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicasp.pri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.